There is a word in Japan for young people who stopped wanting things. Satori generation, the enlightened ones. They are not enlightened. They looked at the cost of an apartment, the size of a starting salary, the age their parents finally retired, and they did the math. Then they stopped. No mortgage, no children, no consumption beyond what is necessary. Japan calls it a cultural shift. It is not a cultural shift. It is a generation that understood the system clearly enough to know that playing along had no payoff. The decisions that generation made in 2005 look identical to the decisions your generation is starting to make right now. This is the Wealth Files. Does Japan feel like a warning or a mirror? Tell me below. In 1989, the land beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was assessed at a value greater than all the real estate in the state of California. Not a metaphor. The actual number on paper, filed and official. Japan's economy had spent a decade inflating into a bubble so large that a single city block in central Tokyo cost more than entire foreign countries. Then it ended. The Nikkei stock index peaked on the last trading day of 1989 and fell 80% over the next 14 years. Property prices collapsed. Banks that had lent against inflated asset values discovered the collateral had evaporated. Japan did not have a recession. It had a freeze, and the freeze did not last a decade. It lasted 3. Here is what 3 decades of stagnation actually looks like from the inside, because this is not ancient history. This is a live experiment, and your economy is following the same sequence, approximately 20 years behind. The first thing that froze was wages. Japanese workers in 2024 earn, in real terms, less than Japanese workers earned in 1997. 27 years of work, 27 years of productivity, 27 years of corporate profit, and the worker at the end of it earns less than the worker at the beginning. Companies hoarded cash. Shareholders were protected. Workers absorbed the stagnation. Meet Kenji, 34 years old, software developer in Tokyo, earns 5,700 night-harine, above average by Japanese standards. His apartment is 300 square feet. He has no plans to buy, no plans to marry, no plans for children. He is not depressed. He is not disengaged. He ran the numbers on what a mortgage would cost relative to his wage trajectory, what raising a child would cost relative to his disposable income, and what the pension system would deliver relative to what he was paying in. Then he made a rational decision based on that data. Japan calls people like Kenji a social problem. Kenji is not the problem. Kenji is the answer. The only answer an individual can give when the system's own mathematics tell him that participation does not pay. The second thing that froze was the population. Japan's birth rate in 2023 was 120 children per woman. The replacement rate, the number required to keep a population stable without immigration, is 2. 1. Japan is not approaching a demographic problem. Japan has been inside one for 30 years and is still accelerating toward the floor. The consequences are not abstract. 29% of Japan's population is currently over 65. By 2040, that number approaches 40%, which means the working population, the people paying taxes, contributing to pensions, funding the healthcare system, is shrinking at exactly the moment the retired population it is supposed to support is at its largest. Japan is running a pension system with the demographics of a country that no longer exists. The response has been to keep older workers in the economy longer. 1 in 5 Japanese people over the age of 70 is still employed, not because they want to be, because the pension is not sufficient to retire on. And the cost of living in a major Japanese city does not leave room for the gap, the retirement that was promised to that generation, the reward for 40 years of work in one of the most productive economies in the world. Is a convenience store shift at 73. That is not an anomaly. That is the designed outcome of a pension system that assumed demographics that no longer exist, built on an economic growth rate that has not arrived in 30 years. The third thing that froze was the housing market, but not in the direction you would expect. Japan now has approximately 9 million akiya, empty homes, abandoned properties in towns and villages that the younger generation left for cities, owned by elderly people who have died or moved to care facilities, sitting vacant because the cost of demolition exceeds the value of the land in a declining area. Entire neighborhoods in rural Japan are reverting, slowly, structurally, to something that is neither inhabited nor usable. In central Tokyo, prices remain high because demand concentrates where the jobs are. Outside the major cities, Japan is experiencing a housing crisis in the opposite direction. Too much supply, zero demand, properties that cannot be given away. Both problems are produced by the same cause, a population that is shrinking faster than any policy can compensate for. The fourth consequence, the one that makes Japan relevant to every country in this conversation, is what happens to government debt when growth stops and the population ages simultaneously. Japan's national debt is approximately 260% of its GDP, the highest ratio in the developed world by a significant margin. It has been sustained because Japan borrows primarily from its own citizens, a population conditioned to save rather than spend, holding government bonds inside pension funds and postal savings accounts. That worked as long as the saving population was large enough to absorb the debt. As the population ages and begins drawing down savings rather than accumulating them, the buyer of last resort for Japanese government debt begins to disappear. The Bank of Japan has been buying its own government's bonds for years, effectively printing money to fund a debt that the population can no longer fully absorb. It has kept interest rates near zero for decades to make that debt serviceable. When it began raising rates in 2024, the first meaningful rate increase in 17 years, it triggered immediate instability in global markets. The world's third largest economy had become so dependent on permanent cheap money that any change in the cost of borrowing sent shockwaves across asset classes on every continent. Japan did not export its cars and electronics to the rest of the world and then collapse. It exported a model of debt accumulation, of demographic decline, of an aging population serviced by a shrinking workforce, and the rest of the developed world spent 3 decades adopting it, while watching Japan and assuming it would not apply to them. It applies to them. The birth rate in South Korea is 0.72 lower than Japan's. Italy, Spain, and Greece are tracking Japanese demographic curves 15 years behind. The United States, propped up by immigration, still has a birth rate below replacement. The United Kingdom has an aging population, a pension gap, and a generation of young people running the same math Kenji ran and arriving at similar conclusions. The Satori generation did not emerge from Japanese culture. It emerged from Japanese economics. A generation looked at wages that had not grown in 27 years, at housing costs disconnected from incomes, at a pension system promising what it could not mathematically deliver, and it made a rational choice to stop participating in the fiction that playing by the rules had a payoff. That logic does not require Japanese culture to function. It requires only that the numbers stop working. And in country after country, at different speeds and different intensities, the numbers are stopping working. Japan is not a cautionary tale about what might happen if Western economies make the wrong choices. Japan made choices that Western economies have since replicated on debt, on demographics, on housing, on wages, on the relationship between corporations and workers. The outcomes are following the inputs with a delay. The question is not whether your economy will face what Japan has faced. The question is how far along the sequence it already is, and whether anyone in power has any incentive to change direction before the math becomes impossible to ignore. The answer to that question in every country that has watched Japan for 30 years and done nothing different is already clear. If this changed how you see where your economy is heading, the next video goes further. Not just one country's trajectory, but the system that is running out of tools to stop any of this. Hit subscribe. This is the Wealth Files.